Most of us don't think about a knock at the door. It's one of the most ordinary sounds in the world. A neighbor, a delivery, a friend arriving unexpectedly, a family member coming home. A knock means someone wishes to enter. Someone wishes to be acknowledged. Someone is standing on the other side of the threshold. But folklore tells a different story. Across cultures and centuries, people have spoken of knocks that arrive at impossible hours. Knocks with no visitor standing outside. Knocks that seem to come from empty roads, dark porches, and silent hallways. Knocks that serve as warnings. And knocks that should never be answered. Welcome to The Hollow Between, a podcast of folklore, ghost stories, and the uncanny. I'm Candace, and tonight, beside the lantern light, I have a story for you. So settle in with a blanket and a cup of something warm. And if you happen to hear a knock while you're listening, perhaps think twice before answering. There are certain warnings that seem to appear wherever people gather. Warnings about strange lights, warnings about lonely roads, and warnings about the woods after dark. And in Appalachia, there are many such warnings. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for nearly 2,000 miles along the eastern United States, reaching from northern Alabama through Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, North and South Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, and into the Canadian provinces beyond. Across those mountains lie countless small towns, hollows, ridges, valleys, and communities, each with their own stories, traditions, and warnings. For generations, folklore was shared on front porches, around kitchen tables, beside wood stoves, and beneath summer skies alive with lightning bugs. Many of these stories were not told as entertainment. They were told as advice. Simple rules passed from one generation to the next. Don't whistle in the woods at night. Don't answer voices calling your name from the darkness. Don't follow something you cannot see. And perhaps most unsettling of all, if something knocks, be careful before you answer. One of the fascinating things about Appalachian folklore is how matter-of-fact it often feels. There is rarely a dramatic explanation. No long description of a monster. No elaborate tale of a curse. Instead, the warning is simply given, as though everyone already understands. Stories vary from family to family and community to community. But one theme appears again and again. A knock comes to the door. Someone answers, and afterward, something changes. Sometimes the knock serves as a warning. Sometimes it's associated with death. Sometimes no one ever discovers who or what was standing outside. The details differ, but the unease remains. Throughout Appalachia and beyond, many families carried beliefs about unexplained knocks. 3 knocks in particular often appear in folklore. A sound at the door. 3 measured knocks. No visitor, no explanation. Some believed such knocks could be omens, or warnings of illness, warnings of tragedy, warnings that news was already on its way. It's important to remember that folklore is not history. These beliefs were not universal, nor were they always interpreted the same way. But the stories endured, and sometimes that tells us as much as the stories themselves. I think the most unsettling aspect of these traditions is the rule that often accompanies them. Don't answer. Don't open the door. Don't invite it in. Again, explanations are rare. The warning simply exists. And maybe that's what makes it effective. A rule without explanation leaves room for imagination. What or who exactly was knocking? What happened to those who answered? Folklore never rushes to explain itself. It merely places the warning in your hands and lets you decide what to do with it. Death omens have long occupied a place in folklore around the world. Birds at windows, clocks stopping, dreams that feel too real, and unexplained knocks. Many families told stories of hearing knocks shortly before receiving difficult news. A relative passing away, an accident, a tragedy unfolding somewhere far beyond sight. And whether these experiences were coincidence, grief-seeking meaning, or something even stranger, the stories became part of family histories. Sometimes the knock came before the news. Sometimes people remembered the knock only after. But either way, the memory remained. 3 knocks, a silent porch, a feeling that something had been trying to tell them something. Perhaps that is what makes a knock so unsettling. It asks something of us, a choice. Open the door, ignore it, answer, or remain silent. And folklore is filled with stories suggesting that sometimes the wrong choices can change everything. I invite you to join me for tonight's story, 3 Knocks at Blackwood Farm. Samuel Turner had lived at Blackwood Farm for nearly 30 years. The farm sat alone at the end of a narrow gravel road, surrounded by rolling fields and a stand of old trees that seemed to grow darker with each passing year. It wasn't a large farm, just enough land to keep Samuel busy. A few vegetable gardens, a dozen chickens, an aging barn that leaned slightly to the west. The sort of place where days passed quietly. The sort of place where a man could grow accustomed to being alone. But Samuel didn't mind the solitude, not anymore. His wife, Belinda, had been gone for 6 years. Samuel's grief had softened with time, settling into something quieter, something that lived beside him rather than inside him. He still spoke to her sometimes, mostly while working in the garden or sitting on the porch in the evenings. The old rocking chair she had loved remained exactly where she had left it. Samuel never moved it. Some habits became traditions, and others became memorials. The summer the knocking began was unusually wet. Thunderstorms rolled across the hills almost every afternoon. They arrived suddenly, sheets of rain, flashes of lightning, then gone again, leaving behind steaming fields and the smell of wet earth. The first knock came in July. Samuel was washing dishes after supper when he heard it. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not urgent, simply deliberate, measured, as though someone stood waiting patiently on the porch. Samuel glanced toward the clock. A few minutes after 8. The sun had slipped below the ridge, but the sky still glowed blue and gold through the windows. He dried his hands and walked to the front door. "Coming," he called. No answer. He opened the door, and the porch stood empty. The rocking chair moved gently in the evening breeze. Beyond it, the yard stretched toward the road. No car, no neighbor, no visitor. Samuel stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and honeysuckle. The gravel driveway lay empty all the way to the road. Nothing moved. After a moment, he shrugged. Probably just kids. though he couldn't imagine what kids would drive 5 miles into the hills just to knock on a door and run away. Still, the explanation felt reasonable enough. So he went back inside, and by bedtime, he had almost forgotten about it. The following afternoon brought another storm. Rain hammered the tin roof of the barn for nearly an hour before drifting east into the hills. By evening, the clouds had broken apart, leaving behind a sky streaked with gold and lavender. Water dripped from the trees and the fields glistened. Every low place in the yard held a shallow puddle. Samuel spent most of the evening repairing a section of fence that had sagged in the rain. By the time he finished, his shirt clung to his back and his boots were caked with mud. The knock from the night before had largely faded from his mind. Not entirely, but enough. There were always explanations. There usually were. At a few minutes before 8, he settled into his chair with a sandwich and a baseball game playing quietly from the television. Outside, the last light of day lingered over the ridge. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Samuel froze. The sound was identical to the night before. 3 measured knocks. Not hurry, not aggressive, but patient, as though whoever stood outside had all the time in the world. For several seconds, he simply sat there listening. The house remained silent. The television commentator continued speaking about batting averages. Nothing else moved. Then Samuel stood, and this time he didn't call out. He crossed the room and immediately opened the door. The porch was empty. A breeze stirred the leaves of the maple tree beside the house. The old rocking chair creaked softly. There was no car, no person, no movement. Samuel stepped outside. A feeling he couldn't quite name settled into his stomach. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something closer to unease. The yard remained damp from the afternoon storm. The earth near the porch had become soft and dark with rain, and that was when he saw them. Footprints. Samuel stopped breathing for a moment. They began near the edge of the yard. Human footprints, bare feet, deep enough to be clear in the mud. One after another, crossing the grass, moving directly toward the porch. Samuel stepped off the bottom stair and followed them with his eyes. The prints continued all the way to the front steps, then stopped. They didn't turn. They didn't wander away. They had just stopped, as though whoever had made them had reached the porch and vanished. The evening suddenly felt very quiet. Samuel stared at the muddy impressions for a long time. His practical mind immediately began searching for explanations. A prank, a neighbor's kid, someone playing a joke. But even as he considered those possibilities, he found himself counting. 1 set of footprints approaching, none leaving. Then the realization made his skin tighten. He looked across the yard, toward the road, toward the trees, and toward the fields beyond the fence. Nothing. The world appeared perfectly ordinary, yet something was wrong, as though he had missed an important detail, or perhaps as though something was still watching. Samuel returned to the porch and closed the door. Only then did an old memory surface. His grandmother's voice, a summer evening decades ago. They were sitting on a porch swing, rocking gently in the dark. Her warning had been delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for weather forecasts and gardening advice. If it knocks 3 times after sunset, Samuel, don't answer. Samuel remembered laughing. He asked why. His grandmother had simply shaken her head. It already knows you're home. The memory arrived so suddenly that it made him uncomfortable. He hadn't thought about that conversation in years, perhaps decades, and yet the words felt strangely clear, as though they had been waiting. And for the very first time in a very long time, Samuel locked the front door that night. Before going to bed, he pulled back the curtain and looked toward the porch. The moon had risen. Silver light spilled across the yard, and those muddy footprints still waited below. Samuel slept poorly that night, not because he was frightened, at least that's what he told himself, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the footprints, the single line of bare footprints crossing the muddy yard, approaching the porch, stopping, nowhere else. By morning, the sun had dried much of the ground, and by afternoon, the footprints had begun to soften around the edges. Samuel almost photographed them. He almost called someone, but what would he say? Someone walked across his yard and disappeared? The explanation sounded ridiculous even in his own head. So he spent the day working, mending the fence, cleaning the chicken coop, doing all the ordinary things that made a man feel as though the world still made sense. By evening, the unease had faded, not vanished, but dulled, the way sharp edges sometimes do in daylight. As sunset approached, crickets began chirping in the tall grass. The sky turned amber, then rose, then violet. At 10 minutes before 8, Samuel found himself glancing toward the clock. At 5 minutes before 8, he was still watching it. At 2 minutes before 8, he laughed quietly at himself. "You've lost your mind, Turner." The kitchen was warm, the windows were open. A faint breeze drifted through the screens. Outside, lightning bugs flickered above the fields. 8 o'clock had arrived. Nothing happened. Samuel exhaled. Of course nothing happened. The whole thing had become a story in his head, a coincidence stretched into something larger. He poured himself a glass of iced tea and carried it onto the porch. The rocking chair beside him remained empty. Belinda's chair. He glanced at it automatically, then toward the yard. No footprints, no visitors, no knocks. The sky deepened toward night, and for the first time in 2 days, Samuel began to relax. Maybe the strange little episode was over. Maybe... Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from inside the house. Samuel nearly dropped his glass, and for a moment he couldn't move. He couldn't think. The knocks had not come from the door. Not the front, not the back, not the walls. They had come from somewhere deeper within the house. A hollow sound. Wood against wood. 3 measured knocks. From the hallway. Samuel rose slowly. The porch suddenly felt very far from the road, very far from anyone. The screen door creaked as he stepped inside. The house stood silent. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Nothing else. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Hello?" The word sounded foolish the moment he spoke it. There was no answer. Of course there was no answer. Samuel moved through the kitchen and into the hallway. Darkness gathered there. Not complete darkness, but the kind that collects in old houses after sunset. The hallway stretched toward the back bedrooms, toward the room Belinda had once used for sewing, the room that had remained mostly untouched since her death. Samuel stopped. The air felt different, cooler, still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then he saw it. The door to the sewing room stood open, only a few inches, but Samuel was certain it had been closed. He stared at it, trying to remember, trying to convince himself he had simply forgotten. Then something moved. Not inside the room. The curtain at the far window, a faint stirring, as though someone had just passed by. The movement lasted only a second and then stopped. Samuel stood frozen. The hallway was impossibly quiet. There were no insects outside, no wind, no creak of floorboards, and the terrible certainty that if he walked into the room, he would find something waiting for him. The feeling was so strong it nearly made him sick. His grandmother's voice surfaced again, older, clearer, as though she stood directly behind him. If it knocks 3 times after sunset, don't answer. It already knows you're home. Samuel quickly closed the sewing room door and backed away. One step, then another, never taking his eyes away from the doorway. Nothing emerged, and nothing followed. Eventually, he reached the kitchen, then the porch, then the safety of open air. Only when he was sitting outside again did he realize he was shaking. The rocking chair beside him moved gently in the breeze, back and forth. Samuel stared across the darkening fields until the stars appeared. He didn't go back inside until nearly midnight, and even then, he avoided looking toward the sewing room. The next morning, he told himself he would open the door. He would walk inside. He would prove there was nothing there. Just a room, just a memory, just an old house settling. But deep down, another thought had already begun to grow. A thought he couldn't quite dismiss. The knocks had not come to the farm. They had come for him. The following morning, Samuel forced himself to open the sewing room door. He waited until daylight, until the sun was high, until the ordinary sounds of the farm returned. Only then did he stand in the hallway and wrap his hand around the doorknob. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. There was nothing. No knocks, no movement, no whisper of curtains, just silence. Samuel pushed the door open. The room looked exactly as he remembered. Belinda's sewing machine sat beside the window. A basket of fabric rested near the wall. Spools of thread stood in neat rows on a shelf. Dust motes drifted through beams of sunlight. The room was empty, completely empty. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He laughed once, a short, embarrassed sound. What had he expected? Something standing in the corner? Something waiting beside the window? The room was exactly what it had always been. A room, nothing more. And yet, as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the floor. 3 muddy footprints. Bare feet. They crossed the room from the window toward the hallway. Only 3. No more. No less. The mud was still wet. Samuel stared at them. The room suddenly felt colder. Outside, a crow called from somewhere beyond the barn, and the sound made him jump. Later that afternoon, Samuel drove into town. He told himself he needed feed for the chickens, but in truth, he needed other people. He needed conversation. He needed proof that the world still made sense. He spent nearly an hour at the general store talking with anyone willing to linger. Weather, baseball, politics, the price of gasoline, anything and everything. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward old stories, as it often did. One of the older men laughed and said, "You know what my grandmother used to say?" Samuel's stomach tightened. "What's that?" The man shrugged. "If something knocks 3 times after sunset, leave it be." Several people chuckled. Another woman nodded. "My mama used to say the same thing." "Mine too." Samuel said nothing. The older man continued. "Funny thing is, nobody ever explained why." A silence settled briefly over the group. Then a woman stocking shelves looked up. "My grandmother did." Everyone turned toward her. "They say the first knock is curiosity." The store seemed quieter somehow. The second knock is invitation. Nobody spoke. And the third, she hesitated. The third means it already crossed the threshold. The room erupted into nervous laughter, and then someone changed the subject. The conversation moved on, but Samuel couldn't. For the first time since this began, he found himself wondering about something he hadn't wanted to consider. What if opening the door on that first night had been a mistake? The drive home felt longer than usual. The sun had already dropped below the hills. Shadows stretched across the road, and by the time Samuel reached Blackwood Farm, the sky had darkened to deep blue. The porch light glowed softly against the gathering night, and everything looked normal, comfortingly normal, until he stepped out of the truck. There was something resting in Belinda's rocking chair, just a single object, a folded piece of paper. Samuel approached slowly. The chair rocked gently in the evening breeze. The paper contained only 4 words written in careful handwriting. Samuel recognized it immediately. Belinda's handwriting he had not seen in 6 years, and the note read, "Don't answer the next one." Samuel read the note 3 times, then a 4th. The handwriting never changed. It remained Belinda's. The same careful loops, the same slight tilt to the left, the same way she crossed her T's. His hands trembled. For several seconds, he simply stood beside the rocking chair while the evening breeze moved softly through the trees. The chair rocked gently. The note remained in his hand. "Belinda?" The word escaped before he realized he had spoken it, but no answer came. That night, Samuel did something he hadn't done in years. He locked every door. The front door, the back door, the mudroom, even the old cellar door beneath the kitchen. Then he sat at the kitchen table with the note in front of him. The clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, and outside, darkness settled over the farm. He tried to think logically. Someone could have forged the handwriting. Someone could have placed the note there. Someone could have... The thought died before he finished. No. He knew Belinda's handwriting the way people know a familiar voice, a familiar laugh, a familiar face. Some things cannot be mistaken. At 7:45, he found himself watching the clock. At 7:50, he made coffee he didn't want. At 7:55, he turned on every light in the house. And at 7:58, he moved to the living room and sat facing the front door. Belinda's note rested in his shirt pocket. Outside, the last traces of daylight faded beyond the hills. The house seemed to shrink around him. Every creak sounded louder, every shadow deeper. The minute hand reached the top of the hour. 8 o'clock. Nothing. Samuel exhaled. Perhaps whatever this was had ended. Perhaps... Knock. 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 The sound came from the front door. Samuel flinched, and the coffee mug shook in his hand. 3 knocks, slow, measured, patient, exactly as before, then silence. The note seemed to burn against his chest. Don't answer the next one. Samuel remained where he was. The house held its breath. 30 seconds passed, a minute, then another. Nothing. No additional knocks, no footsteps, no voice, only silence. Samuel did not go to the door. 10 minutes later, curiosity won over. Not enough to open it, but just enough to look. He crossed the room and pulled back the curtain beside the door. The porch was empty. Then he noticed something standing at the edge of the yard near the old maple tree. A figure, motionless, half hidden by darkness. Samuel froze. The distance made details impossible. He couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman, whether it was young or old. The shape simply stood there, watching the house, watching him. Samuel's pulse thundered in his ears. The figure never moved, not once, and somehow that was worse. A person should shift their weight, scratch an arm, turn their head, but this figure did none of those things. It stood perfectly still, as though it had been planted in the earth. Samuel blinked and the figure was gone. Not walking away, not retreating, but gone. The yard stood empty once more. Only the maple tree remained, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Samuel slept with the lights on. Near dawn, he dreamed of Belinda, not as she had looked near the end, not tired, not sick, but young and laughing, standing in the kitchen sunlight. In the dream, she held his hand tightly, almost too tightly, as though she were trying to keep him from stepping somewhere dangerous. "Samuel," she said. Her voice sounded distant. "Don't let it in." Then her expression changed. Fear crossed her face, real fear, the kind Samuel had never seen in her while she was alive. She looked past him, towards something standing behind him, something he couldn't see, and before he could turn around, knock, knock, knock. Samuel woke instantly. The room was dark. The clock beside his bed read 4:17 a.m. His heart pounded. The house stood silent. Then from somewhere deep within Blackwood Farm, a floorboard creaked. Not the settling of an old house, not the cooling of wood, but a footstep, slow, deliberate, from the hallway, and then another, moving toward his bedroom. Samuel didn't move. The darkness seemed to press against the walls. Another footstep. The sound came from the hallway just beyond his bedroom. The same deliberate patience that had marked the knocks. Samuel's throat tightened. Every instinct urged him to stay exactly where he was. The bedroom door stood slightly open, just a few inches. A narrow strip of darkness separated the room from the hall. Another step. Closer. Samuel stared at the gap, waiting. A shadow passed across it, not quickly, not dramatically, simply crossing from one side of the hallway to the other, as though someone were just walking by. The movement lasted only a second, then it was gone. Samuel stopped breathing. The house fell silent once more. No more footsteps, no more creaking floorboards. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Samuel couldn't tell. Eventually, the first gray light of dawn began to gather at the edges of the curtains. Only then did he force himself from his bed. The hallway stood empty. The sewing room door was closed. The kitchen was exactly as he had left it. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing appeared wrong. Except for one thing. The note. Belinda's note. The paper no longer rested on the kitchen table. Samuel searched the room, the counters, the floor, the wastebasket. Nothing. And then he found it. Pinned beneath the sugar bowl. A second line had appeared beneath the first in the same careful script. "It knows your name now." Samuel sank into a chair, and for a long time he simply stared. The morning sun climbed higher outside the window. Birds sang in the maple tree. A truck rumbled along the distant road, and the world carried on. But Blackwood Farm felt separate from it somehow, as though the house had drifted a little farther from everything else. That afternoon, Samuel drove to the cemetery. Belinda's grave sat beneath a large oak tree overlooking the valley. He had visited dozens of times over the years. Birthdays, anniversaries, ordinary Sundays, but never like this. Never with fear in his chest. He knelt beside her headstone, and for a while he said nothing. Then finally, "Belinda, if that's really you." The words felt foolish, and yet he continued, "If you're trying to warn me, I need you to be a little clearer." The breeze stirred the grass, and somewhere nearby a wind chime rang, a single clear note. Then silence. Samuel almost laughed at himself. What answer had he expected? A voice? A sign? A miracle? He stood and brushed dirt from his knees. That was when he noticed something lying at the base of the headstone, a folded piece of paper. His stomach dropped. Slowly, he picked it up. The paper was old and yellowed and weathered at the edges. When he unfolded it, he immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Belinda's. But this note was different, older, years older. The date at the top confirmed it. Belinda had written it 6 months before she died. Samuel stared at the words, then read them again and again. The note contained only one sentence. "If it ever comes back, don't let it hear you answer." For a moment, the entire world seemed to tilt because the note did not say, "if it comes." It said, "if it comes back." Meaning Belinda had known about it. Meaning she had seen it and never told him. Samuel remained beside her grave long after he finished reading the note. The afternoon sun hung low above the hills, and the cemetery was quiet. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the grass. He read the sentence again. "If it ever comes back, don't let it hear you answer." Comes back. The words echoed in his mind during the drive home. Belinda had known, not suspected, known, and somehow she carried that knowledge for years without speaking of it. But why? To protect him? Or because she had been afraid to say it out loud? The farm felt different when he returned. The house looked the same, the porch, the barn, the maple tree, but Samuel found himself studying every shadow, every window, every corner of the yard, looking for evidence that something had changed, or perhaps evidence that something had always been there. Inside, he began searching, not frantically, but methodically, the way a farmer searches for a misplaced tool. He looked in the attic, closets, old boxes and cabinets, anything Belinda might have tucked away. Hours passed. Dust coated his hands. The afternoon faded toward evening, and then, in the back of the sewing closet, he found a cedar box. It was small and unremarkable. He had almost overlooked it. Inside were photographs, letters, a few dried flowers, and a notebook. Belinda's notebook. Samuel sat on the floor and opened it. Most of the pages contained ordinary things. Garden plans, grocery lists, recipes. Then halfway through, the entries changed. The handwriting grew tighter and smaller, as though she hadn't wanted anyone to read it. The first entry was dated 7 years earlier, 1 year before her illness. It read, "3 knocks at the door tonight. No one there." Samuel stopped reading. The room suddenly felt very cold. Slowly, he turned the page. Another entry, 3 days later. Again, "No visitor." The next page. "I heard it outside the bedroom window." The next, "It knows when I'm alone." The next, "I think it wants me to answer." Samuel's pulse hammered. Page after page described the same pattern. 3 knocks, silence, no visitor. And then, months later, one final entry. Only a single sentence. It was written so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. "It isn't trying to force its way in. It's trying to be invited. Outside, the sun slipped below the ridge. The room darkened. Samuel looked up. For a moment, he had the strange feeling that someone was standing just beyond the doorway, watching him. He stared into the hallway. There was nothing there, only shadows. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound came from downstairs, the front door. Samuel's entire body went rigid. The notebook slipped from his fingers. The house was silent. No second knock, no footsteps, no voice. Only the fading echo of those 3 measured strikes. Samuel did not feel curiosity. He felt certainty. Whatever had come to Blackwood Farm all those years ago had finally returned. Samuel remained seated on the sewing room floor, the notebook laying open beside him. Downstairs, the house had gone silent. The knock had come, and then nothing, as though whatever stood beyond the front door was waiting, listening. Samuel looked down at Belinda's final entry. It isn't trying to get in. It's trying to be invited. And for the first time, he thought he understood. Every knock, every appearance, every warning, the thing never forced its way inside. It asked, again and again, patiently, the way a stranger might ask to cross a threshold, the way something bound by rules might seek permission. And suddenly he knew why Belinda had never spoken openly about it. Some things become more real when they're acknowledged. Some things listen. Night settled over the farm. Samuel turned off every light. The house stood in darkness except for the pale glow of the moon filtering through the windows. He sat at the kitchen table, Belinda's notebook in front of him. The note from the cemetery was beside it. Outside, crickets sang. The sound rose and fell like distant waves. The clock crept toward 8. Samuel found himself watching the second hand, waiting, dreading, knowing. At precisely 8 o'clock, nothing happened. The silence felt almost worse. 8:05, still nothing. 8:10, nothing. A part of him began to hope. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the front porch. Samuel closed his eyes. There it was, patient, almost polite. A minute passed, then another. No second knock, no voice, only waiting. Samuel remained where he was. The thing had come for an answer, but it would not receive one. Then something happened that frightened him more than the knocking ever had. A voice spoke from the front porch. Belinda's voice, soft, gentle, exactly how he remembered it. Samuel. His eyes flew open, and every hair on his arm stood upright. The voice came again. Samuel, open the door. Tears instantly filled his eyes because it was her voice. Not similar, not close, but her voice. The voice he had not heard in 6 years. The voice he would have given anything to hear again, and for one terrible moment, grief overwhelmed his fear. He rose from the table and took a step, then another, toward the door. The voice came again, closer now. Samuel. His hand touched the doorknob, and then he remembered the notebook. He remembered the footprints, the hallway, the notes, the warnings, and most of all, he remembered something Belinda had written years before. It knows when I'm alone. Samuel stopped, tears running down his face. Belinda would never ask him to open that door, not if she believed it would endanger him. The realization hit him like ice water. Whatever stood outside knew her voice, but it was not her. The voice changed, not dramatically, not all at once. A single word stretched strangely. A familiar cadence slipped. The sound became almost right instead of completely right, and somehow that was much worse. Samuel stepped away from the door, then farther still, and the voice continued calling, patiently, never angry, never demanding, only asking, as though it knew that eventually everyone answered something. A knock, a memory, a longing. The voice continued for nearly an hour, then it stopped. No farewell, no footsteps, no departure, simply silence. The house seemed to exhale. The crickets resumed their song, and for the first time in days, Samuel felt that he had done the right thing. The next morning, he opened the front door. The porch was empty, the yard was empty, the road was empty. Nothing remained. Nothing except 3 muddy footprints on the porch boards, bare feet facing the door, as though someone had stood there all night waiting. After that, the knocks never returned. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The notes remained tucked safely inside Belinda's notebook. Samuel never discovered exactly what had come to Blackwood Farm. Perhaps there was no answer to discover. Some stories are warnings rather than explanations, and some mysteries remain mysteries. Eventually, life settled back into its familiar rhythm. The fear faded, the house felt like home again, and slowly, Samuel allowed himself to believe the thing was gone. 10 years later, on a warm summer evening, Samuel sat alone on his front porch. The sky glowed orange behind the hills. Lightning bugs drifted across the field. The rocking chair beside him moved gently in the breeze. He was older now, content. The years had softened many things, the memory of the knocking among them. A crow called from somewhere near the trees. Samuel smiled, and then knock, knock, knock. The sound came from inside the house, not the back door, inside, from the hallway. That same hallway, that same measured rhythm. Samuel froze. For a long moment, he simply listened. The house fell silent once more, waiting and patient, as though no time had passed at all, as though it had never truly left. The evening breeze moved gently across the porch. The rocking chair beside him creaked softly. Samuel stared out across the darkening fields. The last traces of sunlight had vanished behind the hills. The porch light cast a small circle of gold around him. Everything beyond it seemed swallowed by shadow. And for the first time in 10 years, he remembered something his grandmother had said after warning him never to answer the knocks. A detail he had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget. Her voice returned to him with startling clarity. If it comes back, the crickets fell silent. It isn't because it found the house. Samuel felt a chill move through him. Behind him, the hallway remained dark and quiet. Ahead of him, the field stretched into darkness. And suddenly, he understood. The thing had never been looking for Blackwood Farm. It had been looking for him. The realization settled over him like cold rain. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, knock, knock, knock. Perhaps this is why stories about unexplained knocks continue to endure. Not because we expect to encounter them ourselves, but because a knock occupies a strange place in our lives. It arrives at the threshold, a boundary between inside and outside, known and unknown, safe and uncertain. A knock asks something of us. to listen, to respond, to choose. And once we hear it, we can't pretend it wasn't there. Across Appalachia and throughout the world, people have passed down stories of knocks that arrived without explanation, be they warnings, omens, or simply mysteries that never found an answer. Yet these stories survive, retold on front porches, around tables, and beside evening fires. Not because anyone can prove them, but because they left an impression, a feeling, a question that lingers long after the sound itself has faded. And perhaps that is how folklore survives. Not through certainty, but through memory, through the stories we continue to tell, and through the quiet realization that some sounds stay with us long after we hear them. So if you find yourself alone one summer evening, the windows open, the crickets singing, the last traces of daylight fading beyond the hills, and you hear 3 slow knocks at the door, well, you can do what you like, but not everything that seeks our attention deserves a response. If it knocks 3 times after sunset, don't answer. It already knows you're home. If you have a folklore tale, ghost story, or strange experience you would like to share, please send it to thehollowbetween@gmail.com. And if you've been enjoying The Hollow Between, I would be so grateful if you'd follow the podcast and share it with someone who enjoys folklore, ghost stories, and the uncanny. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me, friends. And until next time, mind the hollow between.